compensating black Americans for slavery and past discrimination is an idea that's been knocked around for decades. And now Democrats want to make it an issue in the 2020 presidential race. Will it backfire on them? I'm Jason Riley from the Wall Street Journal and the Manhattan Institute, and welcome to Deep Dive. Senator Elizabeth Warren told a town hall audience in Jackson, Mississippi last week that it's time to start the national, full-blown conversation on this issue. But the reality is that slavery reparations has been a hot topic for decades, and it's consistently opposed by a large majority of the public. Bills have been introduced in Congress, best-selling books have been written, and class action lawsuits seeking compensation have been filed. However, public opinion hasn't moved much. So what's the real reason for this recent Democratic enthusiasm for reparations for black Americans? Joining me now to discuss is Mene Ukueberuwa, who is an assistant features editor for the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, Deroy Murdock, a syndicated columnist and Fox News contributor, and Christopher Harris, executive director of Unhyphenated America. Thank you all for being here, gentlemen.
Thanks.
So before we get to the merits of the reparations argument that is being made by liberal Democrats, I want to talk to you about the politics of this, the timing of it. Deroy, I'll start with you. Why now? We have Barack Obama, who ran in 2008, rejecting this idea. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, 8 years later, rejecting the idea. But now we have people like Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and even Bernie has changed his tune on this issue. What's going on?
I remember talking about this issue a lot back about the year 2000, 2001, and then September 11th happened. And I think a lot of people thought, you know what, we need to be united. Let's get this off the agenda, and that issue went away, I thought, once and for all. And now it's back. And why is it back now? I think there are two reasons. One is strategic, and the other is competitive. The strategic issue, I think, is that the black turnout in a number of elections has been lower than Democrats would like, costing them seats. Back in 2016, Donald Trump won 8% of the black vote. That doesn't sound very high, but Mitt Romney only won 6%. So Trump actually outperformed Romney by a third. And so I think perhaps Democrats think if they get this issue in the 2020 race, it'll get blacks to turn out and they'll do better. In terms of the competitive aspect of it, you've got 13 now and every day another Democrat running for president. And I think each one is trying to get further to the left. And so it was Medicare for all. It was let's abolish ICE. And then a couple weeks ago, let's bring back reparations, which Elizabeth Warren pushed, as well as Julian Castro. And I think maybe they think that'll get them to the far left, but somebody's going to leap over them and go even further, I'm sure.
Well, Chris, let's pick up on that. Is this an issue of no clear front runner? Let me say something to get attention. So let's get rid of the Electoral College. Let's pack the Supreme Court. Let's break up Amazon. Is this a part of that?
They're trying. It's desperation. At the end of the day, they're pulling everything out of the hat that they can. And as Deroy was saying, it's like they're having to move further left because they realize that they have a whole lot of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez type people out there who just want whatever the most leftist, regressive, socialist idea they can bring. They want to bring it. And so you have the Marxist dialectic of trying to separate everybody by really the most superficial aspect of our humanity, the color of our skin, and they know this is a wedge issue. But I think most black people kind of look at it the same way. The idea of getting reparations, they look at it the same way as hearing that the Powerball's up to $700 million. It's like, that would be nice if I could win the Powerball, I would do all this. But they don't take it seriously.
But Mene, will it get blacks to the polls? I mean, Hillary Clinton did not get the black turnout that Barack Obama got. Now, probably no one would have gotten that level of turnout, but she didn't get it, and they think that is part of the reason that they lost. I think a bigger reason they lost is because she didn't turn out white voters in states like Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. White voters that had previously voted for President Obama and then switched to Trump. So it's not that they didn't turn out, it's that they did not turn out for her.
Sure.
So here we have a situation where these racial appeals to the black vote might turn off the white voters that I think are even more important to the Democratic Party. I mean, there are millions of those Obama voters that Trump flipped in those upper Midwest states. I think this is a real risk that they could turn off those voters.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you were right. You wrote a couple of weeks ago at this point that reparations are harshly opposed by the white majority in this country, basically 90 to 10, but black support is actually fairly split. And so as an electoral strategy, it wouldn't make much sense to try to say we're going to turn out black voters in a way that might draw resistance from white voters in swing states. I do think that it would probably have some effect on black turnout. I mean, I don't think there's any group in America where when you say, we're going to affirm how much hardship you've been through, and we're going to give you a check to try to make up for that, aren't going to have their eyes open and say, oh, no, maybe there's something worth pursuing here. But I do think that blacks actually are often a little bit more skeptical than they're given credit for being by the media. I think you saw, for example, in 2008, it took a long time before blacks really did completely embrace candidate Obama because they needed him to prove that he was viable and that he would be a serious contender. Again, in 2016, you saw the Bernie Sanders campaign try to make a push based on his credentials as a civil rights advocate. They waited until the South Carolina primary, and then they revealed this photo of Bernie Sanders being arrested for marching with civil rights leaders, and they thought this was going to have a big effect on black turnout. When blacks really are, tend to consider who's going to be the candidate, who's going to, do the best in terms of improving our material circumstances. It can't be bought so easily.
That's a good point. You mentioned how reparations polls among whites, but it doesn't poll as high among blacks as some people might realize. It's around half, around half of blacks. Why do you think that is? Why don't you think reparations polls higher among the supposed beneficiaries of reparations?
Well, I think it goes to some of the other issues we're going to touch on a little bit later, but the question of who is black, a lot of blacks are mixed. They may look at their white neighbors and think, well, is it really that guy's fault that something may have happened to great-great-grandpa, something like that? I think also, going back to the effect of this on regional electoral votes in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, et cetera, I could see people whites in Alabama or Mississippi saying, yeah, there's some sense of white guilt, and look what my ancestors did, so go ahead and tax me some extra, and I'll pay for this. But if you're sitting in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Michigan, you could look around and say, this was never part of the Confederacy, so why are we expected to pay for this? And I think that particularly in that part of the country, which is the exact part of the country the Democrats need to pick up, I think that's going to have this boomerang effect against them that you described.
Well, just to piggyback on what Deroy was saying about the supposed blue wall, right? I had to laugh about the whole idea that Democrats had this blue wall because I'm a big history guy, and really they're cherry picking the data. If you go back, I mean, they say, oh, well, because Democrats had this blue wall in states like Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, the like, going back to 1992. And I'm like, oh, well, if you go back post World War II, which is basically 18 presidential elections, they've only had a blue wall for 5 of those 18 elections. So they're really cherry picking the data to assume that they have this lock on it. I mean, they didn't win it with Donald Trump. He broke the blue wall. Right. So it basically invalidated this whole idea. And as we were all just saying, they're going to lose the majority white vote, the working class, middle class white vote if they pursue that. Which, it's just, they already lost because they ignored them in 2016. If they keep pushing this issue, they're going to alienate them in 2020.
Well, this speaks to me among the divide that remains in the Democratic Party over why they lost. So I don't think it's any accident that you see the more progressive, liberal candidates thinking it was because blacks didn't come out because, or that racist whites were suppressing votes or Russia stole the election, whatever, and more moderate candidates this go round, people like Joe Biden, who are going to focus on winning back those working class white voters. I'd be very surprised if someone like a Biden comes out in favor of this, or even someone like a Beto O'Rourke down in Texas comes out in favor of this, because I think they believe their losing in 2016 had more to do with those former Obama voters, white voters, that flipped to Donald Trump, and they want to focus on going after them, and this does not.
Beto eats dirt, so there's that. There's that whole issue.
And he shares it with his family.
So let's get to the merits of the arguments that people like Kamala Harris and Julian Castro and others are making here, Elizabeth Warren as well. Let's start with the economic argument that they make. And they're not alone. This is one of the arguments that's been made over the decades, that this country benefited, got rich off of slave labor. Some have even gone so far as to say slave labor, the profits from slave labor funded the Industrial Revolution. Mene, is this What do you make of that argument, and what would you say in response to someone who claims that that alone justifies reparations for the descendants of those slaves?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt in the case of the people who actually were enslaved, or maybe immediate generations following after, that there are economic damages that follow from, having been in the bondage of slavery and the immediate aftermath of that. But the idea that there is an entitlement to that sort of reparation that lasts several generations hence is not something that's ever been acknowledged kind of in the legal establishment of this country. And I think you have to see the fact that throughout the history of this country, there have been several periods where blacks were able to make vast material progress before regressing, perhaps in the late 1960s and 70s, that you can't really attribute the poor circumstances of a lot of blacks in this country today to the direct legacy of slavery in a way that would create a claim on a reparation from the government.
Okay. One interesting take on the economic argument that I've read is from Thomas Sowell. I'm sure you're all familiar with. And he says even this assumption that society got richer off of slave labor is not settled. Yes, certain slave holders may have enriched themselves, but that is not the same thing as saying that society was better off. And the example he uses is that the slave South was poor during slavery and continues to be poorer today than regions of the country that did not have slavery. And that not only holds true in the U.S., but in other countries. Brazil imported large numbers of African slaves. The regions of Brazil where slavery existed were poorer before slavery, during slavery, and today than the regions that did not employ slave labor. And you can also go to Europe, Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. Eastern Europe had a more prominent slave trade going on than Western. Western Europe's always been richer. And the other example he gives, and this I find very interesting, is the number of slaves that went into Arab territories in either Northern Africa or the Middle East. Millions of slaves were imported there, way more than came to the West. Those regions remained poor throughout this period, and did not only only became richer when they discovered oil. It was never all of this slavery that increased their quality of life. So I find even to grant that to the pro-reparation side problematic. That is not settled that regions that have slavery are wealthier than
you look at
don't.
where slavery was in this country. In the South, that was an agrarian area. These were people essentially working on farms, picking cotton, etc. In the North, we saw the Industrial Revolution taking place, certainly cotton mills, people who took the cotton and turned it into clothing, people running sort of industrial factories, that sort of thing. You didn't really see slaves in that. Those were not part of the slave infrastructure, if you will, in this country. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. I've also heard the argument, well, slaves built this country, so, hand over the money. You could make the same argument for the Chinese, who were mainly in the West putting in the railroads. I assume they got paid. A lot of those people were left up in the hills to fend for themselves. A lot of them froze to death. You certainly had white pioneers coming across the country. No one really feels sorry for them, but some of them were shot at by Indians and died, or caught awful diseases. If they had not crossed the prairies and settled the West, this would be a small coastal sliver along the East Coast, the original 13 colonies. So do we owe reparations to the descendants of the whites who came across the stagecoaches? I wouldn't make that argument, but I imagine somebody might.
Chris, you can't deny that racial inequality exists in this country and has persisted for a long time. Isn't at least some of that due to the legacy of slavery? And doesn't that justify the government doing something for the descendants of those slaves?
Inequality is such an interesting thing because it assumes that outside of this, all things would be equal. And I say, Spike Lee is rather small. LeBron James is much taller. Yeah. How can you make those two equal? There are certain things that are available to a LeBron James just by virtue of his physical stature that are not available to a Spike Lee. So whether it's height, intelligence, all those things, God did not make us equal. And I think John Adams said something about that, there's no equality in virtue, there's no equality in intelligence or any of that. And so how do we presume to make people equal? I don't know if you guys ever read from Harrison Bergeron, That was, I remember reading that back in, I think, Kurt Vonnegut, and I remember reading Harrison Bergeron, and it's just that whole idea of with the handicapper general.
That's right, yep.
You know, and the idea that, oh, well, government's going, because there's inherent inequality, right, that we're born unequal, so in order to make smart people less smart, we're going to put headphones on them that play sounds that keep them from concentrating, and if you're born naturally stronger or small, we're going to put weights on you, which was an interesting thing because resistance training actually makes you stronger. But it's one of those things. It's like to act as if inequality is something that government can fix. It can't. And just one last statement. Frederick Douglass, I love what he said about what shall be done with the Negro if emancipated, and he said, "Do nothing with us. It's your doing that's done the most harm." Or, as your book, right? Stop helping us.
That's right, yeah. Well, let's pick up on that, Mene, because people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who have argued for reparations, they say there's a moral argument here. And I think what he's basically arguing for, though, is yet another massive wealth redistribution scheme. It seems to me coming from the same playbook as the War on Poverty and the Great Society programs. In his Atlantic piece, he does a brilliant job of laying out why none of that has worked or been adequate, then calls for yet another massive wealth redistribution scheme. Why would this one be any more successful than the ones that have been tried before?
Well, I think you've exactly identified the state of mind of the contemporary left when it comes to racial issues. Basically, their priority is affirmation and redistribution. They think that if you read Between the World and Me, Coates is giving off the impression throughout that the problem of black people in America today is this kind of emotional burden of dealing with the legacy of slavery and discrimination. And if only the President of the United States or the collected leaders of the United States were to come forward and finally give this tearful, emotional apology for all the harm that's been done, they'll be able to alleviate this cloud of depression from black people and finally free them to pursue their ambitions. And then in addition to that, we need to attach a check because, again, on the left, it's always about just sort of the direct material compensation. But at the same time, they use this idea of affirmation and an apology to distract from the fact that their strategy for actually improving the material circumstances of blacks has completely failed. It's a way of changing the subject, and not reckoning with the actual material problems.
Psychic benefits. It'll help the nation heal.
Right.
It'll help us get over a hump. Well, one problem I have with this is that the oppressor is the savior. I mean, these awful people have did this to blacks a long time ago. We're still feeling the effects today, and the only way we can make things right is if the descendants of these awful people save us. There's a certain internal contradiction there,
I think there is, and I've always felt on reparations, sort of my Uber response to it is if we can find any living slaveholder, we should take his money and give it to any living slave. Of course, slavery ended in this country 154 years ago, so these people are long gone, their kids are gone, their grandchildren are probably gone, so we're probably now dealing with the great-grandchildren of the slaveholders and the great-grandchildren of slaves, and then people even younger than that. So there is, yes, the sense that the oppressors are the ones who are going to come in and ride to the rescue. But the moral problem here really is the whole idea of collective guilt.
Yes.
That, it's not just this person who's to blame or that person, but all these people. When you get into collective guilt, you really start getting yourself into a lot of trouble and a real danger zone.
And it's interesting, Chris, that the civil rights leadership of the 60s and 70s opposed reparations for this reason. They said this is a silly guilt gesture. And there were leading civil rights activists, people like Bayard Rustin, who said, yeah, my grandfather might have picked cotton 50 years ago, but he's long gone, and nobody owes me anything for that. Aren't you also telling blacks, though, with reparations, that black people bear no personal responsibility for their current situation? It is all due to historical or external factors. And what kind of message does that send?
It's a very destructive message. I mean, I live in the Metro Washington, D.C. area, and Prince George's County, Maryland they tout the fact that it's the wealthiest, predominantly black county in the whole country. And a lot of the people who live there are federal government employees, and there's lots of six-figure household incomes. But yet, in the state of Maryland, which has one of the best public school systems, Prince George's County is the second worst education, in terms of education, second worst county in the state of Maryland. Of course, the worst is Baltimore City, which is represented by Elijah Cummings. But here's one of the problems, I think, Jason, is that what the narrative is what's most damaging. Because what people want us to believe is that we were savages in Africa, and then we were brought here to America as slaves, and then we got free and we're on welfare. That's basically the narrative. If you ask the average young black man or woman, because I do a lot of mentoring, and they have no idea. The most they've heard of is they've heard of Black Wall Street, but they don't even know the full story behind it. They don't know that, as you know, Booker T. Washington wrote about this with the National Negro Business League. He had a great book called The Negro in Business, and the information is phenomenal. It's interesting because it says that black people in 1910 owned 20 million acres of land. So, I mean, just for context, that's the equivalent of owning the entire state of South Carolina, as well as, I believe, Rhode Island, and a little bit left over. 10 million black people owned 20 million acres of land. So if we were so oppressed, and I'm not belittling the oppression of the Jim Crow era, but how is it that we had all that? Our families were intact.
Right.
You know, so we have this segment that our kids today don't know about because they really believe that all we were was slaves to welfare.
Yeah. And that's true. I want to amplify on that. And this also, that idea that we went from slavery to savagery and then to welfare and so on, completely negates, for example, just one instance, the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes.
Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, the enormous contribution blacks made in inventing jazz and carrying it forward. And that's just one art form and many others. And this sort of paves over all of that and says, well, I guess you guys have done nothing since slavery, so here's your check.
There is a tremendous history there, and you're absolutely right. It is an undertold story that needs a lot more attention. What happened between slavery and Rosa Parks refusing to move to the back of that bus? Income gaps were narrowing. Educational attainment was narrowing. Household ownership was narrowing. It was a tremendous story, and then we get to the 1960s, the expansion of the welfare state, and you see breakdowns in the family. You see a lot of these other trends that had been going in the right direction either slow down, pause, or even in some cases completely reverse course, and it tells you how weak the argument is that you can blame outcomes today to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, unless you believe that legacy somehow skipped a few generations and then reasserted
generations closer to the actual crime that happened.
Well, just to say, like, you know, since we're here in New York, you have, I think I just saw something the other day about the black enrollment in Stuyvesant High School decreased again, and, you know, Thomas Sowell went to Stuyvesant, and he's talked about that at length, that there were more blacks going to Stuyvesant. That's right. When he, and was it, I can't remember if it was Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams said that he's glad, I think it was Walter Williams said he's glad that he got his education before it was fashionable for white people to like black people. You know, because he said it's like, you know, because then they didn't care about, you know, how about your feelings. It was more about, will you learn reading, writing, and arithmetic? Yeah, exactly. You know, and those things are absolutely crucial because we're graduating young black men and women today, but we're not really educating them. We're basically pushing them out of school, giving them this piece of paper that says that you've been educated and that you're ready into the workforce. But the school that was named after Ben Carson in Detroit, I looked up the stats. I mean, it was supposed to be a science and technology school. They have something like an 85 or 90% graduation rate, but when you look deeper in the state boards, only like 25% of the students meet the criteria for reading, and like 17% meet the criteria for math. And so it's those things, it's like, that is more damaging than the legacy of slavery.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That is a terrible disservice.
Let's, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to get on to how practical this would be to even attempt to implement, assuming the government did decide to do something about it, Mene. You have most white Americans today are not descendants of slaveholders. They came here after slavery. You also have the problem of thousands of black people who themselves own slaves in this country, thousands of Native Americans who own thousands of slaves as well. And then who is black? Who's going to get to claim some of the spoils here? Are we going to use a one-drop rule? How many cheaters will there be claiming minority status to get a piece of the pie? And Elizabeth Warren would know something about,
and how black is
that.
She may have a drop of black.
So how do we even grapple with all of this as a practical matter?
Sure. I mean, I think if you think about the progress that's been made over the past half century in terms of moving toward a state where people are defined by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, the quickest way you could possibly undo that would be to create a massive federal program to determine exactly how black or how white everyone is, and then decide how much they're going to pay in or receive based on a system of that.
Absolutely.
And I think when we talk about just sort of the idea that blacks may or may not be owed a reparation from the government, we're totally eliding the fact that this government and this nation have welcomed blacks into the franchise. I mean, perhaps you could make an argument that this country was enriched in some way by the labor of enslaved blacks, or by, discriminating against blacks in terms of housing and employment. But now that aggregated wealth and that legal legacy is something to which blacks have been welcomed gradually, not perfectly, but over the course of the past few decades. And so we ought to think of ourselves as inheritors of that. And a system of reparations would create a formal divide between blacks and everyone else that would sort of negate the idea that we are partial possessors of this franchise today.
Yeah, I would say that the two examples will show you how quickly this whole thing will fall apart. If you are a person who lost a great-great-grandfather at Gettysburg, while your family was living in Vermont, let's say, and great-great-grandpa got shot at Gettysburg trying to end slavery, and somebody's saying, okay, you got to hand over the money for slavery. I'm thinking, okay, why am I doing this exactly? And then who's going to get the checks? Do we give checks to Sasha and Malia Obama, who grew up in the White House? It doesn't get any more privilege than growing up inside the White House. So do they get checks?
Their father's not a descendant of slaves.
And their father's not only did he not, and is not a descendant of slaves, he came from East Africa, not even West Africa. He came from the wrong side of Africa in terms of the whole slavery legacy in this country. So do they get checks as well? So those are just two examples that show it. Even if we want to do this, I think it collapses in terms of practicality.
And does it make sense in an increasingly pluralistic and diverse country to continue playing this racial spoils game or this group grievance game? I mean, the fastest growing immigrant group are Asians. You have people increasingly identifying in terms of sexual orientation in different ways in this country. We have more religious diversity than ever. This is a very slippery slope. You are creating all kinds of groups that will want all kinds of special favors due to past discrimination and so forth. And I'm just wondering how practical that is to continue down that road.
Choose to identify as black. I mean, you got to. There you go. Sean King, right? I mean, because you can identify as whoever and whatever you want to be nowadays. Right. Yeah. So what is to stop someone from identifying? Sean King identifies as black. I mean, you have all these things, but like you said, it cannot survive the sniff test, right? I mean, you put it to any test, it's a house of cards. It's going to fall over. Okay. And it's really sad because the 23andMe, we can do any of that, and you'll just quickly find out that you're not as black as you think you are. And it's folly.
And what's this going to do for race relations in this country? Can you imagine the vitriol? I mean, people complaining about the state of race relations today or how divided a country we are. You talk about pouring salt on a wound. Can you imagine what this would do to our conversations, our national? But let me get your response.
Tabasco sauce.
Yeah. But let me get your response. I think that the left's talk of longing for a post-racial society is bunk. And this is the latest example of that. When you want a post-racial society, you don't call for color-conscious college admissions or employment. You don't name your group Black Lives Matter and complain when people say all lives matter. You don't want racially gerrymandered voting districts, and you don't want slavery reparations. They do not want a post-racial society. I think they want to keep race front and center in our national conversation. I think it's identity politics. They think it works for them politically in the ballot box, and I think that's what's really going on here.
Well, Unhyphenated America exists specifically to combat identity politics. And one of the things, like I saw something that said well over 100 million people, about a quarter of the population of the United States, are direct descendants of people who came through Ellis Island. And so how, that was well after slavery. Yeah. How do we sit there and say to them, as you were saying, that you should have to pay because you happen to have white skin, even though your parents were poor in Italy or poor in whatever other nation before they came through, but you're telling them that they have to pay.
Mene, if reparations are not the answer, should the government play some role in tackling the racial disparities that reparations are supposed to be getting at, but we've just been discussing will not get at. What is the role of the government then, if not to just send out checks?
Well, because blacks are disproportionately disadvantaged in America today, as we talked about, all of the policies that the federal government employs to try to promote the welfare of people who are not doing well in America today generally disproportionately flow to blacks. And so I think there are some bad approaches that we've taken at trying to improve the material circumstances of the poor in America today, and the Great Society programs are front and center in that. But there also are issues like education. I think you're right to bring that up, Chris. The inequalities that we see in terms of the education opportunities that blacks have in this country today versus whites and other races. And so we obviously need to continue to pursue education reform and double down on what's actually worked. But unfortunately, the same Democrats who are proposing policies to put an emotional salve on the issue by apologizing for the legacy of discrimination are also the ones who are inhibiting the progress in education reform that would actually help to boost the circumstances of poor blacks searching for an opportunity.
But what also will help is economic growth. We have seen under this president and his tax cuts and deregulations the lowest record black unemployment since the records were kept in early 1970s. That helps black people directly without hurting white people or creating this racial tension and animus that the left seem to crave so much.
So maybe blacks need economic growth more than they need an apology for slavery or reparations for slavery. That makes a lot of sense.
3 or 4% growth can do a lot of good for a lot of people.
We're going to have to end it there. We are out of time. I want to give the last word on slavery reparations to Shelby Steele, who I think summed it up best when he said that slavery can be endured and overcome. It cannot be repaid. And I agree 100% with that. And want to thank the three of you for coming. Mene, Deroy, and Chris, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have. Thank you for being here. Tomorrow there will be another deep dive. Please join us then. I'm Jason Riley.